Hey, thanks for clicking on my video. Seb Heslow here, and if you want to avoid burning your house down, then you better stick around and watch this full video because it's going to be jam-packed with important information about how to safely power your mining rigs. So we're going to be covering three main things in this video. The first one being just general safety advice about your power supplies. The second thing is we're going to dive deeply into sort of how the power works within your components, like your GPUs and your GPU risers, because that is important to understand, and it's not as difficult as you might think. And if you understand how that works, you're gonna be very well equipped in powering your mining rigs safely. And the third topic that we're gonna cover is how to use multiple power supplies for the same mining rig safely. So let's jump into it, shall we? Right, so let's start by talking about our power supplies. Now, I've got an EVGA 850 watt power supply here, and what that means is that this power supply is rated to deliver 850 watts max. However, that said, you never want to be actually pulling 850 watts out of a power supply like this, because you want to be adhering to something called the 80% rule, which means you only ever want to be using 80% of the maximum power that a power supply is rated for. So for an 850 watt power supply like this EVGA, you only ever really want to be pulling 680 watts, which is 80% of 850. And that is basically the only thing you need to know in terms of just general power supply, sort of electricity safety, right? So that means we can move on to the second topic of this video, which is understanding power for our components. So I have a GPU here and I have a riser, right? So what we need to understand is we need to understand how much power is moving through all of our cables. And there are two main concepts that we need to understand here, and we need to understand the difference between them, right? So there is the concept of the amount of power that can travel through a specific cable safely, and then there is the concept of how much power a female connector will ask for. Okay, so even though we've got a 8-pin PCIe cable here and a female 8-pin PCIe connector here, they're not the same. So what do I mean by that? Well, as you can see to start here, this cable has two male PCIe connectors, and that is because a PCIe 8-pin cable like this one can actually safely deliver up to 300 watts. Now, you do want to be sticking with the 80% rule there as well. So let's call that 240 watts safely. Okay? But a 8-pin female connector will only ever ask for a maximum of 150 watts. Yeah? So a female connector will only ask for 150 watts, but a 8-pin cable can deliver up to 300 watts safely. So I'm hoping you understand like the sort of difference between those two concepts. There's like a difference between how much the actual female connection will ask for and how much the cable can transport safely. Okay, I hope I've made that clear. Right, so now that we understand that concept, let's move on to learning about how much power different connectors can ask for. So we already went through quite thoroughly, and a female 8-pin will only ever ask for up to 150 watts. We then have a female 6-pin, like on this riser here, that will only ever ask for up to 75 watts. And then we also have the by 16 PCIe connector here, which those will also ever only ask for up to 75 watts. So what does that mean in terms of this card? Well, it means that theoretically it could ask for 150 watts plus 75 watts, meaning 225 watts total. However, we know that this is a 1660 Super with a TDP of 120 watts. So what does that mean? Well, that means that no matter what, this card is only designed to never ask for more than 120 watts. So the TDP means the maximum amount of power that a card will ever ask for. So that means it will never pull a full 150 watts from the 8-pin connector here. It could pull a full 75 watts here and then make up for the remaining 45 watts from here, for example. Or it could pull, you know, 100, all of its power, 120 watts from the 8-pin connector at the top here, and pull almost zero out of the by 16 PCIe connector at the bottom. But the point is that we do not know how this card will ask for its 120 watts of power that it wants. So that gives us a good segue into talking about PCIe risers and safely powering PCIe risers. Now, if you want a really thorough explanation about safety and PCIe risers, then I highly recommend you check out the video by Red Fox Crypto, where I think he talks for like half an hour just about safely powering risers with different connectors. It is such a beautiful video about just power safety, and I learned so much from that video. I highly recommend you check it out. Link for that will be in the description of this video. But so the gist of it is, since we know that this slot here might ask for up to 75 watts, that means that when we feed power to this riser, we need to do it in a way that we know can safely deliver 75 watts. Now, you might see on many risers like this one a SATA port right at the front here. And why that is such a problem is because a SATA cable is only rated to be able to deliver a maximum of 54 watts. So if you power your riser with SATA and you plug it into your GPU like this, and your GPU decides that I'm gonna pull the full 75 watts that I can from the riser, and the riser gets its power from the SATA port here, that means that you are overloading the SATA cord, and that is a fire hazard. So that is why, generally speaking, everyone within the mining community discourages people from powering your GPU risers with SATA. So what is the better alternative? Well, it is to use the 6-pin port on your riser, because as we spoke about earlier, a 6-pin port is rated for delivering up to 75 watts. And we know from our PCIe cables, like this one, the cable itself is able to deliver up to 300 watts total. So that means if you were to use this cable, plug the 8 pin into the GPU and the other 8 pin, although you take away the 2 to get a 6 pin, and you plug that into your riser, that means this whole cable that can deliver up to 300 watts is only going to deliver 120 watts maximum, because that is the maximum that this GPU will ask for. But what if you have 2 of these GPUs, right? Well, what you can do then, because we know that a single 8 pin like this one can safely deliver up to 150 watts, and we know that the cable itself is rated to deliver up to 300 watts. We can put an 8 pin splitter like this one on each of these 2 8 pins. Actually, let me just do that real quick, hang on. So as you can see here, what I've done is I've taken the 2 8 pins and I've split both of them into another 2 8 pins on each strand, right? So what I can do now is I can power the GPU and riser for one graphics card, and the GPU and riser for another graphics card. But let me explain to you what I cannot do with this. And that is, if let's say I have 4 of these GPUs, I cannot use these 4 for the 8 pin connection at the top of the GPUs for 4 different GPUs. So I can't plug this into the 8 pin of one GPU, this into the 8 pin of a second GPU, this into the 3rd GPU, and this one into the 4th GPU. Now, the reason for that is, yes, we know that this GPU will only ever pull 120 watts. However, we don't know where that power will come from. We know that it will pull a maximum of 75 from the PCIe slot, and we also know that theoretically it could pull all of the 120 watts from the 8 pin. So let's just say that it will do that. That means we're getting 120, 240, 360, 480 watts moving here. And that all comes from this single cable here. And what that means is that this cable that I'm holding right now, that is only rated to be able to deliver 300 watts, may now have to deliver 480 watts, which is obviously a major fire hazard. And that is why you need to understand these concepts, so that you can plan out how you are going to power the components of your mining rigs safely. And now, of course, not all cards are like this card that pulls 120 watts and has a single 8-pin connector at the top. There are cards that will pull a lot more than that and have more power slots at the top. What you might have is a card that is rated with a TDP of 240 watts, so double what this is, and that might have 2 of these 8 pins at the top, right? So what you could do then is you could take these cables, hang on. So what you could do then is you could take a cable like this, and you could split one of them and feed those 2 into the top of the GPU like this, and take the single strand here and feed that to the riser for that specific GPU. And that is because we know that that GPU will only pull a max of 240 watts through the 8 pins and the PCIe slot combined, which means the riser, right? The riser and the 2 8 pins. So that is why we can safely power a 240 watt card using one strand like this. But what we should not do in a situation like this is, let's say we have our dual 8 pin like this from the splitter going into the top of the 240 watt GPU, and then adding a splitter to this and powering and using one of those to power the riser for this one, and another one to power the riser of a second GPU, let's say. And the reason for that is we don't know how much power that second riser is going to ask for. And if it asks for the full 75 watts, that means we're going to be pulling 240 plus 75, which is 315 watts, which again is more than what this cable can deliver safely. So basically, the short of it all is you need to keep in mind how much power a cable is able to deliver, which in this case for an 8-pin PCIe is up to 300 watts. And then you need to understand the concept of how much will each thing that I plug it into potentially ask for at the most. And then you need to be able to make sure that what those can ask for at most is less than what your cable can safely deliver. Does that make sense? Yes? Shall we move on? Good. And now, since we touched on powering risers safely, let's just touch on these boys as well. Can you see? Molex cables. And here again, the concept of what a sort of female connector will ask for and what a cable itself is capable is relevant again, because these cheeky risers, they don't really follow the sort of regulations that there are surrounding the Molex connectors. And this is just my understanding of the whole concept, so take that into account. There is a possibility that I am wrong about this, but from my understanding, there is a standard for how much a Molex female connector should ask for, and that is 54 watts total. Now, don't get that confused again with how much a Molex cable can safely deliver, because Red Fox Crypto also talks about this extensively, and he did such an amazing job doing research about Molex cables. But there isn't a proper standard for how much power a Molex connector can provide safely. However, it is a fairly safe bet that a Molex cable should be able to deliver at least 75 watts safely, which is what the Molex on a riser might ask for, since we know that a by 16 PCIe slot can ask for up to 75 watts, which means that 75 watts will come from the cable you power your riser with, which could be your Molex, right? And that is why I say these risers are a bit cheeky, because these connectors are only supposed to ask for up to 54 watts. But in these risers, they might ask for up to 75 watts. And that is why some people, I've had comments before of people misinterpreting this, saying a Molex male can only safely deliver 54 watts. And that's not the case. The case is that a female Molex should only ever ask for a maximum of 54 watts. So just like a, an 8-pin connector here should only ever ask for 150 watts. But we know that a 8-pin cable like this one can deliver up to 300 watts safely. So just keep that in mind, and that is why I say, I'm just gonna echo what Red Fox Crypto says in his video, which is try to avoid Molex if you can, because there isn't a clear standard for how much these males can deliver. However, if you are in a pinch, you could take a cable like this one and just use just one of the male connectors to power one riser, and you should be safe. Okay? Cool. All right, so now finally, let's talk about how to safely use 2 power supplies for one mining rig. Now, to plug in more than 2, there's a couple of different ways. For example, you could use one of these add to PSU chips. I'm not going to dive too deeply into how the actual setup works, because this video is about how to power your components safely. So let's move on to that instead. And what I'm going to talk about is just what should you plug into what when you're using 2 power supplies. And the rule goes like this: all of the components that are directly linked to the actual motherboard, so that means all of the connectors on your actual motherboard, which means the 24-pin motherboard connection, the CPU connection, as well as other things that might be plugged into your motherboard, like an SSD, or if you have a motherboard like this one that requires additional power, then all of those needs to come from one and the same power supply. Yeah? And your secondary power supply should only ever power sort of external components. For us miners, that means our GPUs, right? So the second thing to take into account is the GPU and riser for a specific GPU should both need to be plugged in and powered by the same power supply. So what I mean is, you can't plug the power connectors for the GPU into one power supply and the riser into a different power supply. The reason for that is you need to always plug things in so that in case one power supply dies on you, you will still be safe. And what I mean by that is, let's say, for example, we have this GPU plugged in and we are feeding it power from one PSU at the top to the 8-pin here, and from the other PSU to the riser. Well, what's gonna happen if our secondary power supply dies is all of a sudden there is going to be no power fed to the riser, which, if you're lucky, that just means that the GPU will stop working, it will power down, no harm, no foul, right? However, if you are unlucky, that means that this GPU is going to start trying to pull all of its power through the top 8-pin here, which your primary power supply might not be ready to deliver, which of course then can lead to fire. But even worse, let's imagine the opposite, right? So let's say this power supply dies, the one fed into your GPU. That means the GPU might now try to pull the full power through the riser, which the riser is only plugged in with one 6-pin that can only deliver up to 75 watts. And this being a 120 watt TDP GPU means that it's gonna try to suck 120 watts through that poor little 6-pin, which that is obviously not good and very well may lead to fire. So use the same power supply for the GPU and riser. Yeah? Cool. And now a final tip here is after you've plugged your whole mining rig into power, right? Let it run for a little bit and then gently go and feel all of your cables like this. And why you're doing this is they should not burn you, not even close. They might be a little warm, that is normal, you know, and that might be from, you know, we're pushing, you know, these GPUs, they get warm and then that hot air gets pushed around, it may heat the cables up. But none of these should be hot to the touch. They should absolutely not burn you. That means way too much electricity is moving through these cables, and that means you should power down your rig immediately, and you should figure out why so much electricity is being pulled through your cable, and you need to fix it right away. Now, another note about using multiple power supplies for the same rig is that you want to make sure that both of your power supplies are plugged in on the same circuit in your wall. And that is because you don't want one fuse to blow, causing one of your power supplies to go down, but the other one to stay on. What you want is if the fuse blows, both power supplies goes down and your whole mining rig shuts down. Yeah? So to wrap things up, guys, let's just go through everything quickly one more time. So you want to make sure you are staying within 80% of the total wattage of your power supply. You want to make sure you understand how much each cable can deliver. And for a 8-pin PCIe cable, that is 300 watts. And you want to make sure that it's plugged in a way where the total sum of the connectors it's plugged into will never pull more than 300 watts. As a matter of fact, you probably want to stay within 80% of 300 watts to be safe. A 8-pin connector can pull up to 150 watts. A 6-pin can pull up to 75 watts. A by 16 PCIe slot can ask for 75 watts, but what you need to take into account is how much power the GPU itself may ask for in total, and that is the TDP. So that means if a card like this that with a TDP of 120 watts, that means that it is not going to ask for 150 plus another 75, totaling 250 watts. It means the card in total will only ask for 120 watts split between the two connectors. Yeah? And when plugging in two power supplies into one mining rig, you want to make sure all of the components directly plugged into the motherboard are powered by the same power supply. So all of the connectors on the motherboard, as well as small peripherals like your SSD or your hard drives, yeah? And you want to make sure that each GPU and its riser are both getting power from the same power supply. And you want to make sure that both of your power supplies are connected to the same circuit on the wall. But that is basically it for this video. If that has been helpful to you, then please give the video one of these. I'd really appreciate that. And what you gotta do now is click on one of the videos on the screen, because this video is over. You could also click on my face to subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate that. But yeah, click on that next video and I'll see you there. Bye bye. Goodbye. Bye bye bye.